In 1998, a hot-shot rider from Texas stepped onto the Tour de France podium for the first time. He raced against the best riders in the world over 3 mountain ranges, across 2,408 miles of France, through endless fields of sunflowers, drinking in the oppressive late summer heat. He wound up third, behind 2 greats of the era. Though his career would later be tainted by a doping confession, it was a great moment for American cycling fans. The Tour de France has always been a party run by Europeans. Then, for the first time in almost a decade, an American had crashed it. Under an ash-gray Parisian sky, he stepped up onto the podium. Hundreds of fans chanted his name. I am talking, of course, about Bobby Julich. That's probably not the disgraced Texan champion you had in mind. That would be Lance Armstrong. 7-time Tour de France champion turned 0-time Tour de France champion. And honestly, Armstrong is way more famous as a cheater than as a champion. In fact, he's probably the most famous cheater of the century. But he was far from the only rider who binged on banned substances during that era or any other. That's the point of the Julich fakeout, to show that Armstrong wasn't unique. I'm Patrick Redford, and this is Only If You Get Caught, a show about breaking the rules. The history of professional cycling is also the history of cheating. Riders have always sought any advantage they could get their hands on. Nitroglycerin, strychnine, cocaine, ether, alcohol, amphetamines, oxygenated blood, EPO, and even straight-up carbon monoxide. Athletes structure their lives around improving performance. They spend their days training, taking supplements, sleeping in hyperbaric tents, injecting painkillers, hiring teams of trainers, undergoing complicated surgeries, receiving blood platelet injections, whatever it takes to improve.
We're looking at breathing patterns, we're looking at his posture, we're looking at the tempo and speed of the basketball.
Doing 9 water practices a week, 3 weight room sessions, and 2 dry-land sessions.
You know, I'm doing yoga and Pilates and stretching and massaging and, you know, cupping and all those things that try to help, you know, rejuvenate my body.
The big question, though, is where you draw the line between legitimate performance enhancement and performance-enhancing drugs, between trying your best and cheating. Plenty of drugs are illegal, either because they are dangerous or too effective. And anti-doping officials decide which is which based on an ideal, the quote-unquote natural body. But that term is maddeningly imprecise. When you're evaluating a drug for its advantages, do painkillers count? What about antidepressants? What about hormones? What makes a body natural? Follow this line of logic far enough, and it starts to sound a lot like another argument happening in sports, the anti-trans panic.
Right now, we are in a moment of intense anti-trans backlash that seemingly started with bathrooms and sports. And it's really strange.
Last month, President Trump signed an executive order to ban transgender athletes from participating in girls' and women's sports. White House correspondent
Both panics come from anxieties about athletes manipulating their bodies. Which brings us back to Lance Armstrong. His improbable rise and acrimonious fall changed the course of professional cycling. It bridged doping's shady, imprecise past to its professionalized future. And it gave us the language to talk about cheaters. But that language would later be used to condemn an entirely different class of athletes.
Hey, are you ready to play cheat sheet?
All right, let's do it.
All right, I'm starting the stopwatch and you have a minute to tell me who benefited, who was the arbiter, what was the rule supposedly broken, and what were the stakes. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay, who benefited in this scandal? Obviously, Lance Armstrong benefited, but also sort of all of his teammates, because the thing that distinguishes the USPS doping scandal is its professionalization, the way that it was a whole team effort. And so really he's the guy who won all the tours, but many of his teammates also benefited. Who was the arbiter? This is a sort of interesting question because this happens when a lot of the big international anti-doping agencies are getting formed for the first time. So WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, was formed in the wake of a scandal that happened right before Lance's first tour win. So the actual the identity of the arbiter is a fairly interesting sort of fluid part of this story. Also, the UCI, the Union Cycliste Internationale, which is the French name for the governing body of cycling. The rule is supposedly broken. You can't put EPO in your blood. It's like we'll get into it. It's a really, really powerful drug. Like that movie Icarus about the guy who uncovered all the Russian doping, that started with him basically like, I'll get EPO off the internet and just see how much I can improve my performance. It really works. What were the stakes? I mean, it's the Tour de France. It's like the only race that matters in cycling. Like if you go to the Tour, all the names of the winners are on there, and Lance's name is on there, but it's just crossed out like 7 times. It's this like very stark reminder that like winning this thing really matters, but then like doing it illegitimately will like get you. He's banned from the sport for life. Him and one other guy in this story who we'll get to. Like Lance tried to show up to a mountain bike race a few years ago, and he was like told to leave because he's just banned from the sport forever. So that's the story.
Wow.
Is that a minute?
That was a minute and 38 seconds, so just under the wire.
Wow. I mean, like 100 seconds is a really good unit of measurement for a minute, so I feel pretty good about that.
A minute is what you define it as, actually.
That's right. Okay. Let's get back to the guy you thought I was talking about in the intro, Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong's story is almost mythic. He was born to a 17-year-old mother, abandoned by his father, then beaten by the horrid stepfather from whom he inherited the Armstrong name. Armstrong's athletic talent was clear the moment he touched a bike. He broke out first as a triathlete and quickly established himself as one of the best endurance athletes in the country. By 19, he committed full-time to cycling. Within a year, he landed a contract to ride professionally in Europe. Teammates and opponents alike describe him as an elemental force of competitiveness. His strength was only matched by his will to win. That will was maybe even pathological. When you watch old footage of him, though, you get the sense that he doesn't care. Here he is in an interview in 1989 when he was 16.
I just like competing with the best, man. I like beating those guys. I love beating people. You know, within the next 5 years, that's definitely my goal, to be the best triathlete in the world. You know, no questions. Hands down, the best.
Winning was all that mattered. By 21, he won a stage of the Tour de France and the World Championships in Oslo. He was headed for big things. And then, for the first time in his career, he started losing. The riders beating him were all on the Italian Giwes Ballon team. The peloton suddenly seemed way stronger. We now know they were powered by the mad scientist, Dr. Michele Ferrari, an Italian sports doctor who pioneered the use of a drug called EPO. Ferrari once infamously said, "EPO is not dangerous. It's the abuse that is. It's also dangerous to drink 10 liters of orange juice." This got him fired, and he started a private practice. What is EPO? In 1983, a team of scientists from Amgen successfully cloned the gene for erythropoietin, or EPO. EPO stimulates the production of red blood cells, so it's used to treat anemia and several kidney problems. But that also makes it an incredible drug for anyone who wants to win an exercise contest. It's brutally simple. If you have more red blood cells, your body can more efficiently distribute oxygen, and you can perform at a higher level. EPO was banned in 1990, but that didn't stop anyone from experimenting with it. It didn't become a real problem until Ferrari took over Giwes 4 years later. Forced to adapt by a significantly faster sport, Lance first started taking EPO in 1996. That season started out well for him, but then he made a startling public announcement.
On Wednesday, October 2nd, I was diagnosed with testicular cancer. The CAT scan revealed that my condition has spread into my abdomen. For now, I must focus on my treatment. However, I want all of you to know that I intend to beat this disease, and further, I intend to ride again as a professional cyclist.
While Lance was away for cancer treatment for nearly 2 years, the EPO crisis came to a head. Just before the 1998 Tour began, Willy Vogt, a staffer for the French Festina team, was stopped while driving a large truck along the Franco-Belgian border. Police found a staggering amount of EPO and other drugs. Festina was allowed to start the tour, but the whole team was booted by stage 7. The media and French police conducted more investigations and found that riders on several different teams were doping. Angered by the scrutiny, the riders revolted and staged a pair of strikes. The charismatic French rider Laurent Jalabert convinced a good chunk of the peloton to get off their bikes and sit in the road in protest. Fewer than 100 riders ended up finishing the tour.
Well, the International Cycling Union know now there are cheats in this sport. They must show they are strong, they must increase the penalties for the offenders, and they also must make stronger doping controls.
This was a disaster for the sport. Cycling authorities insisted on their right to police athletes for unfair advantages, while riders fought for their right to privacy. The Festina affair led to stricter anti-doping rules and the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency. Cycling's doping revolution and the UCI's counter-revolution had rocked the sport, but they had a plan for restoring credibility. Organizers dubbed the 1999 Tour de France the, quote, Tour of Renewal, which, in retrospect, is one of the funniest things to ever happen. While all that was happening, Lance made an incredible recovery. Him getting back on the bike alone was a huge story, but he wasn't content with merely becoming a professional cyclist again. He and his USPS teammates came to the 1999 Tour with a plan to win the whole thing. Lance took his two chief climbing lieutenants, Tyler Hamilton and Kevin Livingston, with him to grueling altitude training camps, while the rest of the professional peloton was racing through the cobbled roads of Roubaix or the forests of the Ardennes. The USPS riders opted for monastic isolation in the Alps. Lance also brought in mad scientist Dr. Ferrari to help, and you know what that means. He also brought his EPO. Though the fact that they were injecting EPO is less interesting than how they were doing it. This was right when professional cycling was introducing tons of anti-doping measures. More people than ever knew about it, and there was a ton of scrutiny on riders. But USPS was still figuring out ways to do it without getting caught. So it wasn't the fact that they were cheating that made this story remarkable. It's that they were cheating so efficiently. Now, I realize that asking anyone to read a 202-page PDF is ludicrous, but the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency's 2012 report on systematic doping at USPS is a riveting read. It has an astonishing level of detail, like there's this one tidbit where Lance got a masseuse to apply makeup to cover up an injection mark on his right arm before the 1999 Tour started. The report also shows an incredible level of professionalization. Armstrong, USPS Director Johan Brunel, and Dr. Ferrari set up a transnational network of drug suppliers that allowed riders easy access to EPO wherever they were in Europe. They figured out how to manipulate riders' hematocrit levels to stay below the acceptable thresholds. They constantly stayed ahead of whatever new drug test the UCI rolled out. It didn't always work, as we now know that Armstrong tested positive a number of times, but amazingly, they got around that problem too. In 1999, Lance tested positive for the banned steroid cortisol, and he faked a backdated prescription. The next year, French authorities dug through USPS trash and found a bunch of syringes and other medical waste, and Lance invented a diabetic staff member who needed the medicine. The year after that, he straight up tested positive for EPO at the Tour de Suisse, and according to two former teammates, Lance and Brunel bribed the UCI to cover it up. Less committed people would have given up or at least stopped doping after getting halfway caught, but not Lance. The USPS squad was like an organized crime ring, and Armstrong was the boss at the top, pulling all the strings. Lance won the 1999 Tour, then the 2000 Tour, then the 2001 Tour, then the 2002 Tour. He won again in 2003, 2004, and finally in 2005. Throughout that time period, people constantly suspected him of doping. He proclaimed his innocence as loudly as he possibly could. It didn't work. After a pair of federal investigations, it all quickly came undone. Dozens of former teammates came forward. The level of detail was as granular as it was damning. There was no question. Lance had not only doped, but created a sophisticated team-wide doping network. His 7 tours were stripped. I said this earlier, but if you ever go to the Tour de France, you'll see a big list of the past winners. Lance's name is on there, but it's crossed out. The message is that doping started and ended with the cocky American. I think a lot about this old Nike ad, where Lance directly addresses the perception of him as a pharmacological wonder as he undergoes a drug test.
Everybody wants to know what I'm on. What am I on? I'm on my bike, busting my ass 6 hours a day. What are you on?
This ad has aged like milk. Armstrong was on EPO. The inconvenient thing is, though, he really was on his bike. One legacy of the Armstrong case is this assumption that the line between clean and dirty is the same as the line between winning and losing. That's never sat right with me. It assumes he was a unique cheater. It also ignores the long, strange history of the idea of the natural body, which is what this sort of cheating in sports was defined against. The way to contextualize the Lance Armstrong story is to look at that particular history. The first doping controls were actually put in place in the 1960s, and they evolved in parallel with another controversial aspect of athleticism and our ideas about the natural body: gender controls. To get a sense of the history of gender in sports and where it interacts with our story about doping, I spoke to the journalist Reo Eveleth. Last year, Reo published the podcast series Tested, which considered the plight of athletes with so-called differences of sexual development and presented a fascinating history of the way sports have drawn the gender line. Something that really struck me about Tested was the way that the history of doping controls evolve alongside like the most serious sort of organized gender testing. So as a way to just sort of get us into this topic, can you tell us about the first 800-meter race at the Olympics for women? That like floored me.
Yeah, it floored me too, frankly, when I was first researching this. So women's inclusion in the Olympics kind of happens slowly. They're allowed in certain sports first where like they're seen as more feminine sports, things like tennis, that kind of stuff. Track and field is a holdout. The first time women are allowed to compete in track and field is 1928. Many men already are saying, this is a terrible idea. This is too strenuous, too onerous, right? This is the man's sport. And women are allowed in 1928, and they run a variety of races. The 800 is the longest race that they are allowed to run at the time. And they run the 800, and the headlines afterwards are depicting this like absolutely depraved scene. Women are collapsing. It's just madness. It's clearly not okay. There is actually footage of the race. And if you watch the footage, you will see what looks like a fairly normal race. If you've ever watched any track and field at any level, they run around the track twice. At the end, they put their hands on their knees. One woman kind of falls down at the end in the way that you see often after a track and field race. And so, yeah, she falls on the ground. She gets up immediately. Clearly, she's fine. But the way that this is covered is just a complete moral panic around how this is clearly hurting these women. They can't possibly do it. It's ugly. This is a thing they explicitly say, that the faces that they're making are ugly. It is unattractive to watch women compete. And so after that 1928 race, there are two things that happen. The first is they immediately start questioning whether these women are really women. And then the second thing is that they ban the 800 for women. For many years, for decades, women don't run the 800 because it's just too much, allegedly, for them.
Why question the femaleness? Like, what is the, I guess this is just this maybe too big of a question, but like, what is sort of like the history or like anxieties motivating like these like so-called male qualities that they are like totally fixated on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. And you see, it's this classic thing where when you have something that is so entrenched within a certain kind of culture that it feels natural, even if it is not, such as binary gender, right? This idea that there are male things and there are female things, and that is sort of this immutable fact of the universe that some cultures really have. That doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And so what happens as you watch it is that the sort of target changes and the words change and this thing we're looking at changes, but the actual core thing is just, I'm uncomfortable with being shown something that doesn't fit into the worldview that I have learned. And so you see this in 1928 when these women are running. You see men saying, well, clearly no woman would ever want to be an athlete. That's a man thing. And so any woman who even desires to compete in sports must be a man somehow, in some way, right? You have that. You have these women's bodies don't look feminine to my eye. It's really fascinating to read these descriptions of these women. So, for example, in 1928, Hitomi Kinwei is this Japanese runner. And in the newspapers, they describe her as just being jacked. Like she's built like a linebacker. You hear all this stuff. And then, you know, you and I probably have in our minds what linebackers look like today. And you look at this woman and she looks like an absolutely average person. Like you would like she's walking down the street, you just be like, that's a regular like you wouldn't even think she was an athlete. Like, you know, just the standards of muscularity, the standards of what people look like, right, have changed a lot. There's also like race in part as going on here as well. And so you see these sort of the target moves and the words change, but there's this core idea that sports are for men. And so anything women do and anytime women get good at it or want to do it or are exerting themselves in that way, that there's something fundamentally wrong about that. And we need to kind of figure out how to protect them from themselves, protect them from something, and regulate their participation in some way. And so you see that over time, over and over again, from the very, very beginning, that women need to be protected. The women's category is considered a protected category, unlike the men's category. And you just see all of this ideas around, well, sports are dude things. Sports are for men. And any women who do anything in that space, something's got to be wrong with them.
Another thing that struck me about this series is the way that like ideas of purity are imposed onto women's sports, like from the jump, and that those ideologies of purity are like informed by German-style 1930s thinking.
Yeah.
What about that? Like, what did you learn about that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the men that are very influential in the early eras of women's sports in the 20s and 30s are not only just regressive in the way that we might think of, okay, they're sexist, they are also very invested in a very particular form of femininity that is white, that is Aryan, that is sort of very specific. And when the Nazis come to power, you see a lot of sympathy within the global sports community for that project, right? This idea that sports are meant to showcase and find the most pure elite men, right? That is the point of them. I mean, the Olympics are founded by Pierre de Coubertin, who is a French guy who watches France lose a war and is like, the French aren't manly enough. We need to encourage sports education and we need to have an Olympics. We need to bring the Olympics back, right? This modern Olympics, we need to bring it back because the Greeks had it right. They were sort of developing these warriors that were these pure sort of athletic specimens. That's the core founding story of the Olympics, right? And so it makes sense that it rolls right into the Nazi project, right? This sort of showcase of the most elite, the most pure, the most sort of pure in a very specific formulation, the way that the Nazis think about it. And so, you know, women already kind of don't fit into that project, right? They're sort of already not really part of it. But if women are going to sort of begrudgingly have to be there, then they need to be the most sort of feminine, the most, again, white, you know, Aryan, that they're sort of that platonic ideal for the Nazis of an athlete. And so you see Nazi doctors proposing sex testing, and you see American sports officials like Avery Brundage, who was a very vocal supporter of the Nazis, who was sort of the real driving force behind making sure that the United States did not pull out of the 1936 Olympics the way that people were suggesting that we did, and we obviously should have. There's in Michael Waters' book, The Other Olympians, there's a really great section about this, about the ways in which Brundage really fought to keep the U.S. in the Olympics. And in fact, there was a really strong protest movement in that time. There was a really strong push to try and pull us out because, I mean, obviously we should not be participating in the Nazi Olympics. And Brundage said no. And it was in his writing, it's very clear that he is very much a Nazi sympathizer, very much he's explicit that he does not like Jews, right? Like he's, you know, there's no subtleties here. And so you see sex testing gets wrapped into this idea of these women who are competing are probably fundamentally impure in some way anyway. They call them borderline cases. They call them all sorts of things. This is before we have an idea of quote unquote biological sex, which is already kind of its own problematic phrase. But so you see that push to try and eliminate anybody who might not look a certain way in that class. I mean, this is part of the Nazi project. It's all kind of fuzzy definitions based on what they want, but you see it extend to sports as well.
If you're enjoying this episode of Only If You Get Caught and you're wondering how you can support us, the best way to help the show is a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening right now. Going back to that Nike ad.
I'm on my bike, busting my ass 6 hours a day. What are you on?
That's the infamous part. But I'm actually more interested in what came right before.
This is my body, and I can do whatever I want to it. I can push it, study it, tweak it, listen to it.
Out of context, it's a straightforward description of working out. That's how sports work. Lance did not begin in a state of athletic purity, one that he tainted with the presence of EPO. He was always a highly talented athlete who enhanced his training regimen with a bunch of drugs. Drawing a hard line between the clean athlete and the doping one relies on a bit of willful self-trickery. It imposes the black and white frame of legality onto something as fluid as the human body. I accept that you have to draw that line somewhere, but thinking in polarized terms of doping and clean allows you to miss what actually distinguishes athletes from each other. Remember, Lance Armstrong won all those tours against a field of other dopers. That's not to say that he was innocent because everyone was doing it. Even if you were to make that case, you'd have to contend with the fact that he was better at doping than all of his competitors. But in a totally clean version of cycling, Lance still would have been a great rider. Here's Reo again.
So I'm really interested in this question of when does it become cheating, especially given that we know that there's this theory in sort of talking about sports and ethics and philosophy called tolerable unfairness, right? This idea that at the end of the day, we all know that nothing is inherently fair. Like fairness is kind of this subjective thing. And we all know that sports isn't fair in that way, right? We know that, again, you and I are not given an equal chance at this. There's this great quote from the 1974 documents for the IOC about sex testing. And it says that the purpose of femininity tests carried out on women athletes taking part in the Olympic Games is to make sure that all female athletes compete under identical anatomical conditions. And unless we're cloning people, that's not happening. You know what I mean? That's just not happening. And in fact, we wouldn't want that, right? We watch sports because we want to see all of these people. I mean, this idea that we even know what the perfect body is, I think is incorrect, right? You see Usain Bolt, who shows up, people there's no way, he's too tall, this and that. And then he, breaks every record, right? I just think that is not only impossible, but also it would ruin sports if we were actually doing that.
Yeah, there's a beauty in that, right? That we can't explain everything.
Yeah, and this idea of sort of tolerable unfairness is really interesting to me because even I think the most idealistic sports fans recognize that there are disparities in access to coaches, in equipment, right? We know that even just the tracks that people are running on now are faster, right? We know that there's so many the basketball shoes, right, that people are wearing now. I mean, this is why people love to fight about who's the GOAT or whatever, because you can't actually compare them, right? Because we know that you can't really compare them. So it's sort of this interesting thing that I think all sports fans know. And then when you get into these cases of, okay, well, then what really counts is cheating, and which kinds of doping are cheating and which kinds of, what does that mean? You have WADA regularly banning things that don't actually confer advantage, but people just think that they do. And so what does that mean? Or Sha'Carri getting, banned for weed when everyone's okay, but obviously that's not performance enhancing. There's this thing that I think is really interesting about how we kind of have to make decisions about what is and isn't fair. But there's no this is not empirical, right? This is just something that is a gut feeling. And it does sometimes, I think, mean that the thing that I think about a lot is that we, in the quest for more science in sports and more data, the result of that is that you wind up often treating athletes like machines. And they are not, right? Athletes are people. They're human bodies that are surprising and weird and react differently and are inherently outliers, which means they're even more surprising, right? We're not talking
Yeah, that's the appeal of sports.
I say this with great affection. Elite athletes are freaks of nature. This is why we watch. This is what we want, right? I want to see that. Right, that's the appeal. And so whenever you're talking about an outlier, you're going to get weird results, weird reactions. Things are just in that weird zone. To reduce them down to just a machine where put more X in, get more output. That's not how it works, right? It makes it seem like anybody could do it because we're all machines, right? I could just put more of it in and then I could be there. And that's not true. Like, I'm never going to be, I could take an absurd amount of testosterone and I will never be an elite athlete.
Cycling has finally emerged from its dark days. While it's definitely cleaner, cyclists and other elite athletes have gamified how to train and eat and follow precise drug plans while staying within the guidelines. Again, you have to draw the line somewhere. But the mistake is thinking of that line between cheating and licit training as a hard, immovable one that distinguishes natural athletes from cheaters. There is something very interesting about how, like, that is always the rubric under which, like, trans athletes specifically are excluded. And then, like, when they have to define, like, that specific definition of fairness as being, like, the point of sports is fairness, which doesn't really seem to vibe with me. And that seems to sort of fundamentally misunderstand, like, what competition is about.
Well, also fair to who, right? Like, who are we talking about? It needs to be fair. Well, we only ever seem to be talking about one group of people who we have to be fair to, and that's cis women, basically, because they need to be protected. And it goes back to that same paternalism, right? And that same kind of conversation. And the reason it's not easy is that fairness is subjective, right? I mean, there are people who I really like and respect, and we disagree on certain things, right? And it's not because I think that there's some terrible bigot or whatever. I mean, it's about nuance, but yeah, there are things where I'm like, okay, to me, that doesn't feel fair. And to them it does, and or vice versa. And so it's tough. You have to kind of have really hard conversations about, like, values and what the point of anything is and why are we doing this? And it's really sort of sludgy. And there's been a sort of a devaluation of the kinds of humanities skills that make those conversations easier and better. And so, I mean, and it's the same thing. I talked about how we've pushed towards, science and data and medicine. That's what matters in sports. And that means that you now no longer have people who can have these kind of more philosophical, difficult humanities conversations about fairness because they're not in those offices anymore, right? It's all about data. It's all about maximizing efficiency and collecting biometrics and all of that.
The natural body is a myth, one that undergirds our understanding of both doping and sex policing in sports. And as the most infamous cheater in modern American sports history, one whose public image was crafted using these explicit terms, Lance and his case have advanced this myth. That's a key part of Lance's legacy. After his comeback, he retired for good in 2011 while he was facing numerous lawsuits from the federal government. He would eventually be sued for $100 million and settle the case in 2017 for $5 million. The messy fallout lasted longer than his career did. Banned for life from most cycling events, but finally free to speak his mind, he did what anyone in his position would do. In fact, he did what I did. He started a podcast. Lance now hosts a podcast called The Forward. It's a lower wattage and significantly less kooky take on Joe Rogan, with a guest list that is more business-style thought leaders than guy who claimed to have smoked weed with an alien. In the summer of 2023, Lance began a 7-part series about, quote, the participation of trans athletes in sports. His first guest was famously anti-trans trans woman Caitlyn Jenner, which should tell you a good deal about what the content of the series was like.
But let me first start to have some conversations around this and what, from all sides, right? Whether it's yourself or scientists or sports ethicists or philosophers or even from the trans community, and really start to understand, is there nuance here? Or is this highly politicized? Or
the question itself is fundamentally uninteresting. It assumes there is such a thing as a, quote, trans issue in sports that needs to be discussed. If you only paid attention to Fox News, you would assume there were millions of trans athletes trying to force their way into girls' sports leagues around the world. But that's not true. The number of trans athletes actually competing in organized sports is way smaller than this noise would have you think. And sporting federations around the world already had functional guidelines for trans participation years before right-wing bigots decided to make trans athletes a wedge issue.
You hear this all the time from people And I do think that largely it comes from people who don't really care about sports, actually, right? And don't really watch sports or think about sports. And so they've never really thought about or met any athletes. And so they don't understand what it's like to be an athlete and the sort of like intense competitive nature. And just, I don't know, there's a certain thing that I hear people say where I'm like, oh, you just don't watch sports. Like, you just don't watch sports, because that's just like not a thing that would happen. But also, I think there's this idea that someone would go through, and I hope that in the future it is not the case that this is true, but being trans in the United States, particularly being a trans woman in the United States, is incredibly challenging. It requires a ton of financial resources. It requires to get transition. It requires having access to all sorts of medical tests even before you even get to, like, there's all these hurdles. You then are, faced with a barrage of people telling you that you're disgusting, that you're like inherently pornographic. Like, it is not easy. Or if you want the easy route, this idea that this is the easy way to win medals, if you want the easy way to win medals, you should just dope, right? Like, that's way easier than becoming trans. Like, I'm just saying, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
It just makes no sense. And you just see these people. I remember I wrote about Oscar Pistorius a lot before he murdered his girlfriend, and about these questions of advantage, right? Because people were talking about him and how he has this advantage in theory because his legs are so much lighter because they're made of carbon fiber, et cetera, et cetera. And I would hear people say, if we allow Oscar Pistorius to compete, mothers in third world countries are going to cut their babies' legs off. And I was like, this is not a thing that is going to happen. Like, I'm sorry, but you can't just make things up like this and claim that this is a real art. You know what I mean? There's so much just like fan fiction being written about like what's really going on in this way that it's just hard to take seriously.
In 2023, Lance went on a dumb Fox reality show called Stars on Mars. He left after he made his fellow stars mad by continually trying to debate them about trans athletes in sports.
So listen, this is real simple. You want to transition? Let's do it. You have your own category. We're going to have a whole new division. We'll celebrate you just like we celebrate everybody else. Let's go. What's unfair about that?
To me, I think we just have to care about if you otherize people. It's not like good for their mental health. Like otherize people.
What's that mean?
Like kind of like.
The irony of Armstrong, of all people, making an argument about fairness of all things is profound. Olympic medalist figure skater Adam Rippon, who was on the show, told Entertainment Weekly, "The person talking about this is the most recognized cheater in all of sports." He, as well as anyone, should understand that factors like skill, genetics, class, and chemical interventions can't be plotted neatly on a graph that defines fairness in precise terms. I also find his obsession with and misunderstanding of the issue to be instructive. He is the single figure in American sports who most define the public's understanding of cheating and cleanness. The formulation of a cheater always requires a counterexample by which to define them, which is not as simple as it seems. As an active competitor, then a recusant liar, and finally a teary-eyed man in a suit admitting his guilt, Armstrong's case was always put in stark, binary terms. His body was natural, or it was not. That's not the extent of the insidious anti-trans panic, though it forms the foundation of genetic determinism from which bigots launch their attacks. If only Lance cared to understand his own role in breaking things. Only If You Get Caught is written and hosted by me, Patrick Redford. It's produced by Alex Sujong Laughlin, with production support from Jay Toll Vieira. Editorial support from Tom Lay and Audrey Martovich. Justin Ellis is Defector's projects editor. Mixing by Samantha Gatzik. Show art by Jim Cook. Jasper Wang and Sean Kuhn are Defector's business guys. Thank you to the Defector staff. Defector Media is a collectively owned, subscriber-based media company. Only If You Get Caught is a proud member of Radiotopia.
Radiotopia. From